The New York Times has potentially significant new reporting on the type of aircraft the Pentagon used in its first strikes on Caribbean boats back in September, details that could be considered a war crime. According to the Times, citing officials briefed on the matter, the plane used in the strike was mocked up to look like a civilian aircraft, possibly causing those on board the vessel to drop their guard before the attack. 11 people were killed in the strike. Joining us, New York Times Washington correspondent Charlie Savage. So, Charlie, walk us through your reporting.
Sure. Thanks for having me on. So, we're familiar with how the first boat attack back in September has attracted a lot of controversy, including because there was a follow-up strike that killed the initial survivors. And the context to this is that a lot of people outside the government think that all of these attacks have been illegal. Every killing has been a murder. The Trump administration has argued that they're lawful because Trump says there's an armed conflict between the United States and drug cartels. And even if you take that at face value, killing follow-up initial survivors who have been shipwrecked would be a war crime under the laws of armed conflict. What's new here is a second layer to that, which is it turns out that the aircraft the United States military used to carry out the attacks on that boat was not visibly military. It looked like a civilian plane. It was painted in a way that was not military, did not have military insignia on it. It carried its weapons inside the fuselage rather than under its wings. And it apparently got low enough that the people on the boat could see it. And so there is a war crime under the laws of armed conflict called perfidy, which is basically treacherous killing. And it says that you cannot feign protected status, like being a civilian, in a way that gets the adversary to drop its guard and then attack them. And usually that's in the context of not them first attacking you, but there's other ways in which they could drop their guard, such as not taking evasive action or not knowing that they ought to surrender because a warcraft is coming at them. And so there's been, it turns out, behind closed doors inside the Pentagon and in the deliberations between Congress and the executive branch since the oversight effort began, in addition to all the questions about attacking shipwrecked survivors and whether that was a war crime, there's been this whole other conversation we did not know about, which was the use of this airplane painted in a way that made it look like a civilian aircraft a war crime to attack these people perfidiously?
Charlie, the Pentagon says they were acting under all legal protocol. I'm curious, is it often that we have aircraft that is mocked up to look like this and which holds weapons that are hidden in the fuselage? If that is something that's against the law and could be considered a war crime, why do we have that in our arsenal?
So there's definitely a few planes that look like civilian aircraft. They're derivative of, for example, a Cessna. There's one that's a derivative of a 737 Boeing jet that the United States military uses. Usually those are painted gray, and they say things like U.S. Navy. The P-8 Poseidon the Navy has, for example, are 737s. But we know that there are some that are basically white, or they have like a blue stripe, but there's no military insignia on it. There's not that circle with the star, they call that a rondelle, that says this is a military plane. As far as I can tell, talking to law of war experts, the mere existence of these aircraft in the arsenal is not a war crime or a conspiracy to war crime because there are applications in which it would be lawful. You can, for example, transport things on a plane without saying that it's military. You might, in a hostage rescue situation, not want to advertise that you're military. But things change when it's used for an offensive attack. You cannot, under the laws of armed conflict, as a lawful combatant, conceal the fact that you're a combatant and then attack after inducing reliance on your adversary into thinking that you're actually a civilian. It's the use of something like this in an attack that makes a difference.
Yeah, really interesting. Charlie Savage, thank you very much. And joining us now, former Deputy Judge Advocate General of the U.S. Air Force, Major General Stephen Lepper. General, thank you for joining us. What do you think of what Charlie just reported?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Well, Charlie just did my job for me. He did an excellent job describing what the laws of armed conflict say in a situation like this.
The mere existence of these planes, as Charlie was reporting, that doesn't seem to be the issue here. Why, if the Pentagon, if it's against protocol, if it's against the laws of combat, why would the Pentagon, can you find a justification for the Pentagon doing this and using it in this manner to strike Caribbean alleged drug boats?
No, as Charlie said, there are aircraft in the military inventory that are not marked as military aircraft, but those are aircraft that are typically not engaged in dropping weapons. Matter of fact, they're not armed at all. And in this particular case, when Charlie talks about perfidy, when the law talks about perfidy, what perfidy really means is that they are acts that are committed in order to basically, the act would be to feign or imitate a medical aircraft or or in this case, a civilian aircraft, so that they could gain advantage over the enemy. And when the military aircraft that are not painted as military aircraft are usually employed in military operations, they are not in a situation where they're dropping bombs. And more importantly here, the key fact here that Charlie reported was that this aircraft was visible. And in order for perfidy to exist, you have to have an intent to deceive. And you also have to have a situation where the people you're trying to deceive are in a position where they can rely on the deception. Normally, these aircraft fly at 30,000 feet, and you can't see them or how they're painted from the ground. In this particular case, if the aircraft flew close enough to the survivors so that they could either do something or not do something that would have put them in a more advantageous position because they thought this was a civilian aircraft, then those are the requirements of perfidy, and it seems that they existed in this case.
So last month there was a lot of drama around Senator Mark Kelly and others in Congress releasing a video that said, as a service member, you have a duty to refuse illegal orders. Would this be an illegal order if somebody was telling you to fly this plane or this drone that is mocked up to look like a civilian aircraft and to fly it visibly and then to strike? Would that just be an open and shut, closed case of an illegal order that the person who was operating it should have refused?
I would say it very well could be. In the situation with an aircraft described the way Charlie did, there are two ways to identify the aircraft. One is through its transponder. The transponder is basically an electronic emitter that identifies a certain code that is reserved for the military. And if another aircraft that has a transponder or a ground station or someone that has a transponder hears the code, they'll know it's a military aircraft. The second is how it's painted. And in this particular case, the crew flying at an altitude where the aircraft couldn't be seen may very well have been able to drop weapons on their target because the fact that their paint job wasn't military was not a factor. In this case, if the aircraft got close enough so that the survivors saw the paint job, then I would say that they've now crossed over into a situation where what they are doing is illegal, and in order to do that would have been an unlawful order.
All right, General, thank you very much for joining us. Major General Stephen Lepper, I appreciate it, sir.